electoral sphere. However, the electoral systems adopted in different contexts have important implications for the extent to which challenger parties such as populist parties can exercise influence on the system. The role of leadership. The most important aspect of populist mobilization is the role that leadership tends to play in these movements. Mudd and Kaltwasser, 2017. The defining feature of leaders is their ability to mobilize masses of supporters and push through political reforms that may often be quite radical in a given context. Although the styles of leadership adopted differ, all populist leaders share in their attempts to present themselves as the voice of the people and as authentic political outsiders. The role of leadership. Historically, populist leaders have tended to be regarded as charismatic strongmen, which is a concept used to refer to a strong leader who exercises power and is independent of any office and free from constraint. Such individuals typically rule through a cult of personality leadership. This conception of populist leaders has tended to be used for those in Latin America, e.g. Juan Domingo Perón in Argentina and Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, as well as in authoritarian regimes. Increasingly relevant in global north as well. The role of leadership. In contexts where populist strongmen have been in power, the key tactics of mobilization used have included crafting an image of the leader as a person of action and not words, rejection of expert advice, anti-intellectualism, sense of urgency regarding societal breakdown decay, need for large-scale change, atypical communication style, direct appeals to interactions with the common man. The role of leadership. Populist leaders also play the crucial role of defining the voice of the people, much like they define the people and the elite. The construction of this term is dependent on two factors: separation from the elite and connection to the people. The idea that the leader is separate from the elite is fostered through the notion of the leader's outsider status. The connection to the people is linked with the leader's claimed authenticity and to their argument as to why they are part of the pure people and not the elite. The role of leadership. As part of their claim of outsider status, populist leaders tend to present themselves as political novices and draw distinctions between themselves and career politicians. Leaders present themselves as being called into action not by the desire to obtain political power, but by a sense of duty to restore the power of the people. However, most populist leaders tend to belong to the same socioeconomic status of the elite, i.e. more educated, wealthier, and of the dominant ethnic group. The role of leadership. Lastly, there are three ways in which populist leaders have been distinguished. Mudd and Kaltwasser, 2017, outsiders, insider-outsiders, and insiders. Those with true outsider statuses are very rare in that they have no genuine links to the elite and build their political careers completely from outside of mainstream politics. Such leaders, when they do emerge, tend to be more successful in more fluid political systems rather than strict institutionalized ones. Examples of these types of leaders include Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales. The role of leadership. Most populist leaders tend to be classified as insider-outsiders. These are individuals who have not been part of the political elite but have strong connections to them. Such connections often play the most important role in the success of these populist leaders. Examples of these leaders include Silvio Berlusconi in Italy. The role of leadership. There are also those populist leaders who are complete insiders who come from within the ranks of the political elite. Such individuals have typically had long careers in both mainstream or smaller parties. An example of this type of leader includes Viktor Orban in Hungary. However, the notion of insider populism has also been used to refer to mainstream politicians who at times draw on populist rhetoric, Though such examples often do not constitute concrete cases of populism, any questions comments on the methods of mobilization used by populists and the role of leadership, demand and supply factors demand side considerations. For any populist movement party to be successful, there has to be some degree of demand among the electorate for their brand of politics. By adopting the populist ideology to the left-right ideological spectrum, populist actors can craft campaigns which appeal to the most immediate desires among voters. Mudd and Kaltwasser 2017. The simplicity of the core populist message of an increasingly disconnected elite that is self-serving and that rules at the expense of ordinary people can effectively be used to mobilize large numbers of voters. These demands are exacerbated in times of upheavals and crises. Demand-side considerations con. Another important element for the success of populism is a general feeling among the electorate that the political system is unresponsive. Mudd and Kaltwasser 2017. When voters come to believe that the major parties and governments ignore their demands, they become more susceptible to populist rhetoric. Such a phenomenon can become much more prominent and diffused through the contemporary social media environment, which has successfully sparked mass populist mobilizations in recent history, e.g. the Arab Spring. Thus, the rate at which information can be shared with people all across the world puts extra pressure on governments to ensure certain levels of satisfaction among their people in order to in part prevent populist backlash. Supply-side considerations. The key supply-side considerations when it comes to the success of populist parties are the party and electoral systems of a given country. With regard to the party system, populists tend to do best when the major parties increasingly converge on a similar set of agendas, which gives populists the opportunity to brand all political parties as the same. Mudd and Kaltwasser 2017. With regard to the electoral system, populist parties tend to do better in countries with proportional representation systems, PR, relative to first-past-the-post systems, FPTP, though electoral victories are certainly possible in both. Supply-side considerations continued. The role that political parties, populist and otherwise, play in the fostering of populist attitudes and demands among the electorate is key. Dissatisfaction with the status quo alone is not sufficient to determine the nature or success of populist parties. Rather, it is the ways in which these parties frame issues to voters and mobilize them to vote that ultimately matters. Elite cues matter. Alternatively, mainstream parties have the ability to dampen demands for populist politics by politicizing some issues over others. Hypotheses on the rise of populism. Growth of populism worldwide. Populist leaders. Parties in power by country. Source: Jordan Kyle and Brett Meyer. 2020. High Tide? Populism in Power, 1990-2020. Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Growth of Populism Worldwide by Type. Anti-establishment populism. Special interests and the elite exploiting the people. Focus on issues of democratic governance, e.g. Five-Star Movement in Italy. Socioeconomic populism. Business elites exploitative of the working class, focus on issues of capitalism and economic exploitation. Morales in Bolivia. Syriza in Greece, Korea and Ecuador. Cultural populism. Native-born individuals constitute the people and outsiders do not focus on issues of ethnic and religious conflict, e.g. Bolsonaro in Brazil, PiS in Poland, Fidesz in Hungary. Source: Kyle and Meyer 2020. Explaining the Rise of Populism. Four major hypotheses on the rise of populist politics from the 1980s to the contemporary era. The post-industrial transformation of societies. Globalization and the rise of neoliberalism. The changing role of and relationship between the media and the population at large. Large-scale shocks crises. The post-industrial transformation of societies. Populist parties have become prominent since the 1980s as a result of the ways in which post-industrial societies have altered the relationship between social democracy and mainstream political parties. As a result of ideological and political attitude changes among voters in the post-war era, the traditional alliances between key electorates and major parties have been both and realigned. This has caused rising levels of dissatisfaction with mainstream parties and contributed to the emergence of smaller parties, such as populist parties, aiming to represent increasingly disaffected voting blocs. Examples of such major alliances include working-class voters and social democratic parties and wealthier religious voters and conservative parties. Post-industrialism con. The major focus of the post-industrial transformation hypothesis is on the ways in which a rising standard of living and education rates among the populations of Western economies in the post-war era has resulted in a variety of emerging political attitudes and demands on the part of the electorate that have incentivized the fracturing of mainstream party rule. This process has been facilitated by both voters and party agendas. These emerging demands have given rise to new electoral cleavages that go beyond those which most characterized the political sphere prior to the 1980s, e.g. economic and religious cleavages, and that therefore require new representation. Rejection of catch-all parties. Post-industrialism con. This phenomenon is closely related to Ronald Englehart's 1971 post-materialist thesis. According to this theory, the electorates of Western countries over the past 3 to 4 decades have increasingly become electorally mobilized by post-material concerns relative to historically dominant material concerns. This change can largely be attributed to increasing levels of education and material security among younger cohorts who have begun to replace older voters as the key voting blocs in the advanced industrialized democracies. Following the Second World War. As a result, older voters are more representative of traditional values and tend to vote along materialist lines, whereas younger generations are more representative of progressive values and vote along post-material lines. Post-industrialism con. The key characteristic of this transformation among both political parties and voters has been the rising levels of saliency and mobilization away from first-dimension issue orientations and towards second-dimension orientations. First-dimension issues are those which relate largely to economic issues such as labor market participation, wages, income and wealth, redistribution, and welfare state benefits that characterize voting behavior in much of the 1950s-70s, the so-called golden era of capitalism. Second-dimension issues are those which relate largely to a broader range of issues, which are not solely limited to economic matters and include environmental protection, human rights, gender equality, and immigration and multiculturalism that have increasingly characterized voting behavior in the post-1980s-90s post-industrialism con. Thus, the contemporary era has been characterized as one in which the realignment of traditional cleavages along these first and second dimension lines has transformed electoral politics. Gingrich and Hauserman 2015, Hawkins et al. 2015. This process has resulted in the emergence and success of a variety of smaller party families, of which populist left and right parties constitute two. It has also been heavily shaped by both demand and supply side factors rather than solely being limited to changes in public opinion. The salience of economic non-economic issues and party manifestos. In the Western European context in particular, this transformation has played a key role in the emergence and success of smaller party families such as Green and Radical Right parties among others. Megid 2008. The realignment of voters along the first-second dimension cleavages has resulted in declining levels of support for mainstream parties and rising levels of support for smaller parties among voters who feel that major parties no longer represent their values. For example, supporters of radical right parties are increasingly mobilized along the second dimension issues of immigration and multiculturalism. As well, working-class voters who overwhelmingly supported social democratic parties in the past have increasingly defected to smaller parties which have included Green, radical left and radical right parties. Globalization and the rise of neoliberalism. According to this hypothesis, the transition to the neoliberal economic globalization model of the post-1980s era has contributed to rising levels of voter dissatisfaction with mainstream political representation. This model of globalization is characterized by an economic policy regime which includes large-scale privatizations, deregulation, austerity, and the increasing financialization of the economy. Importantly, the rise of the neoliberal model has been accompanied by massive declines in union membership and the decline of the political power of organized labor, as well as the outsourcing of jobs from higher income countries to lower income countries. Globalization con, the neoliberal consensus that has been adopted by mainstream left parties in particular constitutes the so-called third way approach, which has largely been argued to be a key reason why dissatisfaction with social democratic parties has grown over time. The central characteristic of third-way politics is an attempt to pair right-leaning economic policies of liberalization with left-leaning social policies. This approach is meant to reflect a third option between full social democracy on one side and full neoliberalism on the other. Popularized in the 1990s with the Bill Clinton administration in the U.S. Now characteristic of most mainstream parties in the advanced industrialized democracies, ideological and policy dimensions of social democracy, neoliberalism, and third-way approaches. Source: Variantals and Powell. 2004. The globalization con, the processes of economic globalization have been argued to therefore create winners and losers with different sets of political attitudes and desires. Rizzi et al. 2008. Artveld 2016. The losers of globalization are those who are most negatively impacted by economic competition, e.g. lower-skilled, blue-collar manual workers, who exhibit concerns about rising levels of cultural diversity, and are likely to support parties which claim to reverse these trends such as populist right parties. The winners of globalization include more educated, socio-cultural professionals who largely identify as middle to upper middle class and hold more cosmopolitan views and embrace diversity and are more likely to support mainstream parties. Increasingly, the winners of this process have come to be the key constituency for mainstream parties, both of the left and the right, with the losers becoming increasingly disaffected with such parties and seeking alternatives such as populist parties. Share of aggregate manufacturing jobs worldwide over time. Source: the International Monetary Fund, IMF 2018. The changing role of the media. Another hypothesis for the rise of populism pertains to the changing nature of the media and its relationship with consumers over time. In previous eras, the media was a more independent organization which was dedicated to a greater degree to an objective presentation of news and facts. Over time, and especially in the contemporary world, media companies have increasingly become tied to both state and corporate actors, a process which has hindered their ability to remain committed to objective reporting and has increased the ideological biases in their reporting. This process has resulted in rising levels of dissatisfaction with the media, and the desire for alternative sources of information and news among large swaths of the electorate. Media con. This process has emboldened populist actors on both the left and the right to legitimize their views and concerns that the major institutions of society within the state and the media have been captured by the elite to the detriment of ordinary people who are being deceived and exploited by the elite. Relatedly, An increasingly educated population can also undermine confidence in the mainstream media, given that a more educated voting base is likely to be informed about the issues that most influence them. The dissemination of populist ideas through different media channels and the rise of the fake news discourse has also provided populist actors with the opportunity to mobilize large numbers of voters around their causes and contribute to the further polarization of society. Mueller et al. 2017. Trust in the media by country. Large-scale shocks and/or crises. Finally, large-scale shocks have also been hypothesized to influence the rise of populist actors in the political sphere. This hypothesis hinges on the idea that during periods of extreme difficulty, individuals may become more susceptible to certain messages and political agendas that both ascribe blame for a crisis and outline simple plans to address them. Two recent key crises which have had a significant effect on the emergence of populist rhetoric and success have been the 2008 global financial crisis and the 2015 migration crisis in Europe. Shocks crises con. The 2008 global financial crisis was a disastrous economic shock which resulted in populist actors' parties gaining massive levels of support and achieving electoral breakthroughs in many countries worldwide. It also sparked a variety of populist movements such as the Occupy movement, which was highly anti-establishment in orientation and attributed the cause of the crisis to an increasingly predatory capitalist system in which the 1% ruled at the expense of the 99%. Shocks of economic nature have tended to increase support for left-wing populist parties. Shocks crises con. The 2015 migration crisis in Europe has a similar effect on rising levels of support for populist parties, though much more in favor of right-wing populist parties. For instance, anti-immigrant attitudes and rhetoric by parties witnessed a substantial increase in several countries throughout the continent who increasingly adopted restrictive immigration policies in response to the crisis. Shocks of migration refugees crises have tended to increase support for right-wing populist parties, a proportion of countries with populist governments over time. Source: Get or Even Populism. 2020. The Political Economy of Populism. 2018. Vote share for left-wing and right-wing populist parties by region. Source: Get or Even Populism. 2020. Europe, Latin America. Shocks crises con. The nature of a given shock or transformative event is also likely to influence the nature of the populist backlash that may ensue. Roderick, 2018. On one hand, it is much easier for ethno-nationalist populists on the right to mobilize voters on socio-cultural cleavages when shocks come in the form of large-scale migration refugee crises. On the other hand, it is much easier for populists on the left to mobilize voters on economic cleavages when shocks come in the form of trade, finance, and foreign investment events. The nature of such shocks partly explains why right-wing populism has manifested to a greater degree in the European continent and why left-wing populism has manifested in Latin America. However, both processes can occur simultaneously as well, e.g. Trump and Sanders in the US in 2016. Shocks crises con. Thus, it is not necessarily the presence of crisis itself but the way it is interpreted and performed by political actors that is relevant to the rise of populism. A key reason why shocks crises are beneficial to populist parties is that such parties tend to actively mediate the ways in which these events unfold and are perceived by the populace. Such events can therefore act as windows of opportunity for political actors to exploit the worries and concerns of citizens and to frame themselves as the actors most suited to addressing the crises being faced. The political space for populists opens up when such events increase an already prevalent perception among voters that institutions are unresponsive to their needs. Moffat 2015. Any questions, comments on the hypotheses on the rise of populism? We have looked at a post-industrial transformation of society, neoliberal globalization, changing role of the media, and shocks crises discussion questions. Which of the explanations for the rise of populism that we have thus far covered do you find more or less convincing? A post-industrial transformation of society, globalization, the changing role of the media, shocks crises. What are the strengths and weaknesses of each approach? Are there any alternative explanations in your view? Approaches to the study of populism. One of the main difficulties in studying populism as a phenomenon is that the literature on the topic has largely revolved around case studies of specific countries, resulting in findings that tend to be country-specific rather than more broadly applicable. Thus, it is difficult to conceptualize populism as a singular and universal phenomenon. Theoretical and empirical insights in one set of cases may not necessarily be useful in others. Bonikowski and Geiger 2016. This is especially important given that a great deal of the emerging research on populism has tended to focus on the European continent. Therefore, it is important to keep in mind that Western concepts do not necessarily have the transportability to be applied to non-Western settings. This elevates the importance of paying attention to the specific context one studies. Studying populism can, for the most part, there have been three dominant approaches to the study of populism. The first is one that studies populism as an electoral strategy of political mobilization. The second is one that studies populism as an ideology. The third is one that studies populism as a form of political discourse. It is important to note that none of the approaches we will look at are mutually exclusive and can be adopted simultaneously in any study examining populism with their own strengths and weaknesses. Populism as strategy. This approach to studying populism focuses on the unmediated relationship between populist leaders and their supporters. Wayland, 2001, defines populism as a political strategy through which a personalistic leader seeks or exercises government power based on direct, unmediated, uninstitutionalized support from large numbers of mostly organized followers. Thus, studies which adopt this approach to populism tend to focus on the processes which facilitate populist mobilization. These can include the influence of civil society and the degree to which the centers of political representation are institutionalized and how these factors can be utilized by populist leaders to gain support. This approach to studying populism has been the most common adopted by those researching Latin American populism. Populism as strategy can. One reason for the Latin American focus of this tradition is its emphasis on the role of charismatic leaders or political entrepreneurs who mobilize voters based on a certain people elite dichotomy and create mass populist movements as a result. As well, leaders who adopt such strategies tend to depict themselves as political outsiders who are representatives of ordinary people against a system that has left them behind. In this approach to the study, populism is a transient phenomenon that largely ceases to exist once such actors come to power. Populism as ideology. In contrast to the study of populism as a strategy, proponents of this approach are more concerned with the content of leaders' ideologies rather than with their strategies of gaining support. Here, the term ideology is used to refer to a set of ideas whose meaning is derived by their relationships with one another. As argued by Mudd, these ideas mainly revolve around the notions of a corrupt elite and a pure people which can be molded to fit any ideological bent. whether left-wing or right-wing. This version of studying populism ultimately aims to focus on the moralistic vision of society that populists craft and how this vision is used to separate people into good and evil camps. Populism as ideology. Studies relying on this understanding of populism draw on textual sources of data such as election and party manifestos and political speeches to examine the extent to which populist messaging unfolds along the elite people axis. This approach also focuses predominantly on party systems and the changing dynamics around electoral coalitions. Once parties are classified as populist or non-populist, these studies look closely at the constituencies who support populist parties, the leadership styles adopted by party leaders, and the ways in which populists govern once elected. This framework has largely been adopted by those studying populism in the European setting. Populism as discourse. This approach to the study of populism understands the phenomenon as a discursive style of doing politics that is rooted in the elite people dichotomy. This approach conceptualizes populism as a rhetorical style used by political actors who may vary a great deal in their ideological leanings but rely on a similar set of linguistic cues in espousing that ideology. In particular, the focus of this approach is on the use of language in persuading large numbers of people to support a populist cause. Thus, the focus is more on the message being conveyed rather than on the individual actor. This approach constitutes a micro-foundational account of populism in its focus on the variations in the usage of populist messaging by different individuals and on understanding the style of their argument rather than ascribing meaning to their content. Populism as discourse. An important benefit of this approach to the study of populism is its ability to test for within-actor variation when it comes to the use of populist rhetoric and can thus provide a scale on which to measure populism, which can include all types of parties. For instance, studies of the U.S., Bonikowski and Guidron 2016 have found that political candidates of both parties have been more likely to utilize populist discourse in their speeches during the latter half of the 20th century relative to previous eras. Populism as performance. A fourth emerging approach to the study of populism relates to the performative turn in the literature, which focuses more on how populism is performed, acted out, rather than focusing on the phenomenon as an electoral strategy, ideology, or discursive method of communication. Moffat 2016. This approach has become more prominent in light of the criticisms of some of the other major approaches. The electoral strategy approach has been criticized for its lack of generalizability outside of the Latin American context. The ideological approach has been criticized for its binary, elite people nature and for its claim that populism constitutes an ideology at all given its inconsistent nature relative to other isms and its lack of any ideological substance. Populism as performance. Proponents of the performative approach to studying populism define and describe the term in a variety of ways, which include as a political style or as a style of communication. However, they all agree that populism is ultimately a phenomenon that is done, embodied, and enacted. Studies which adopt this framework examine topics like political correctness, the nature of outsider status, denial of expert opinions, and support for the application of common sense in political affairs. Common behavioral traits studied in this framework include individuals' use of slang or curse words, speaking their mind without filtering views, and not conducting themselves in a way consistent with proper politicians. Measuring populism globally. Global Parties Survey (GPS) Norris 2020. The GPS provides an innovative way of measuring populism internationally by charting the development of ideological values and issue positions of different types of political parties globally to develop a comprehensive measure of how populist rhetoric is used by parties. The study relies on a rhetorical understanding of populism as a way of attempting to operationalize the concept in global terms, i.e., making it more generalizable to a diverse set of cases. Thus, the dataset adopts a definition of populism as a rhetoric which espouses that legitimate authority comes only from the will of the people, who are defined in relation to their enemy, which is the political establishment. Populism as rhetoric. This understanding of populism is closely related to the discursive approach. The approach regards populism as a political communication style which utilizes language as the means through which to persuade voters. The rhetorical approach is not concerned with the speaker's personal beliefs or sincerity in the espousal of their ideas, but rather is concerned only with the style and construction of their arguments. Prominent examples of the kinds of rhetoric adopted by populist actors in their attempts to appear authentic and persuasive include Donald Trump's slogans of "Build the Wall" in reference to his proposal to construct a border wall between the U.S. and Mexico, and "Lock her up" in reference to his political opponent Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. Populism as rhetoric. An important element for why this approach pays particular attention to the language and discursive style of populist actors rather than the sincerity of their beliefs is because of the disconnect that often occurs when populists transition from candidacy and campaigns to elected representatives and political leaders. Although there are certainly degrees to which successful populist leaders fulfill the campaign promises they make to voters, it is also very often the case that such promises are abandoned once populists become the establishment, e.g. Trump's "drain the swamp" approach. Thus, the GPS provides one way through which populism can be studied at the broadest level internationally by conceptualizing the phenomenon only as it relates to the use of language which argues for the authority of the people over the elite and contrasts this people with the elite establishment, which is regarded as the enemy. The GPS methodology, to determine the various forms of populist rhetoric that can emerge in a given country context. The GPS draws on four distinct electoral cleavages of party competition along which voters mobilize. Left-right economic values cleavage. Conservative liberal social values cleavage. Socioeconomic cleavage. Cultural cleavage. Each of these cleavages determine the type of rhetoric employed by populist actors, given that they provide the second-order principles which are derived from substantive ideologies across the political spectrum that are coupled with the first-order principles of populism that legitimate power must lie with the people and not with the elite. Electoral cleavages and the dimensions of party competition, Norris 2020. The GPS methodology. The GPS is designed as an expert survey that compares the key ideological values and issue positions as well as the use of populist rhetoric by political parties worldwide. The questionnaire consists of 21 core survey items which are designed to measure all three of these variables. In total, there are 1,052 parties throughout 163 countries represented and responses gathered from 1861 experts on parties and elections. Importantly, the survey includes cases outside of Western democracies which address some of the concerns around paying attention to context as well as to the generalizability of its findings. Key findings. Globally, populist parties tend to be concentrated on the right side of the left-right economic cleavage in their support for free market economies with a minimal role for the state in the economy. They are also concentrated on the right side of the conservative liberal social cleavage in their support for traditional social values and on issues such as nationalism, nativism, and immigration. Examples of these parties include the Spanish Vox Party, the Swiss People's Party, the Alternative for Germany, the Likud Party in Israel, and the U.S. Republican Party. However, even populist right parties are also distributed in other spaces on these cleavages, with parties such as the Danish People's Party being more oriented towards the center-left economically and the far-right culturally. We will explore how these cleavages are distributed among a variety of left and right-wing populist parties globally in the coming weeks. Distribution of populist parties, Norris 2020. Other methods of studying populism, identifying party families and classifying populist parties in accordance with their shared names, Mayer and Mudd 1998. Discourse analysis of party leader speeches and social media content, Heilberg et al. 2017. Content analysis of election and party manifestos such as the Comparative Manifestos Project, CMP, Ruduyan and Powell's 2011. Analysis of roll call votes by elected representatives, Poole and Rosenthal 2001. Surveys of political elites, Baylor 2014. Surveys of public opinion, Ackerman et al. 2014. Expert surveys, Backer et al. 2015. Discussion questions. Which approach to the study of populism is most appealing, convincing to you? Strategy, ideology, discourse, performance, and why? What are the strengths, weaknesses of each? Do you think universal methodologies of studying a concept like populism as done by the GPS are useful, or are such concepts better understood at the individual case level? Summing up ways of studying populism: ideology, strategy, discourse, performance. Definitions of populism. Locke-Lau, multi-class movement consisting of heterogeneous demands in a chain of equivalence, an empty signifier, and an antagonistic division of people into two camps, can be accommodated in both hegemonic and non-hegemonic orders. Mudd, thin-centered ideology around the pure people and corrupt elite and the general will. Muller, anti-pluralist, anti-elitist identity politics and threat to democracy. Summing up: relationship between populism and democracy. Inclusive and exclusive around material symbolic political lines. Positive effects through liberalization, democratic transition, and democratic deepening. Negative effects through democratic erosion, democratic breakdown, and repressiveness. Methods of populist mobilization. Personalist leadership. Social movement. Political parties. Summing up: demand-side factors. Disaffection with status quo politics. Unresponsiveness of parties' government. Supply-side factors. Party convergence. Electoral system. Issue framing. Hypotheses explaining the rise of populism. Post-industrial transformation of society. Neoliberal globalization. Changing role of media. Shocks, crises. Summing up: ways of measuring populism globally. GPS term definition: populism is a political approach that emphasizes the interests and opinions of common people over those of the elite. Populist leaders often present themselves as the voice of the people and claim to represent their interests. Populism has a long history in various parts of the world, but it has gained significant attention in recent years due to the rise of populist leaders in many countries. These leaders often capitalize on the fears and prejudices of the people, such as immigration, economic inequality, and cultural change. Critics argue that populism can be dangerous because it can lead to the erosion of democracy, the demonization of minorities and marginalized groups, and the promotion of simplistic and often harmful policies. However, others argue that populism can also be a necessary tool for marginalized communities to gain representation and advocate for their own interests. Overall, the impact of populism on politics and society is complex, and it will continue to be a divisive force in the coming years.